So, James, I've been looking forward to this conversation since you first met several months ago now. How are you, and where in the world are you speaking to me from today?
I've just moved to Hong Kong from Scandinavia, which is probably the most extreme relocation you can do in this world. I mean, maybe that's an exaggeration, but definitely it's moving from a very slow-paced environment to a very fast-paced environment.
Yeah.
It's moving from one sphere of influence to another sphere of influence. So I'm right now on the 22nd floor of Parasite, Hong Kong's
Wow.
oldest contemporary art institution, where I'm now at. And the humidity's rising, the sun is shining, and it's a whole new situation for me.
A whole new world. So I guess this is going to possibly come at an interesting time for you, the question. So I always open these conversations with this question, which is, if you were to play with the idea that there is such a thing as a global human psyche, what might you sense or feel or say is happening in the global human psyche right now?
Regionalization. Maybe
Regionalization.
that's a contradiction of your question, but I think that there is a hyper regionalization happening, which, I guess goes hand in hand with a kind of desire to return to the analog, an understanding that maybe this idea of globalization that at least I grew up under the auspices of, and let's say in the illusion of, is in fact an illusion.
Mm.
That there is a ground from which we speak, that there is a positionality that we can't simply fly around the world and expect it all to be the same. Of course, this is at the same time saying that has been a mass homogenization that's happened across cultural spheres, across architectural spheres, across, societies in general. But I do think we're living in this moment where there is a very interesting form of regionalization that is playing out politically or geopolitically, but is also playing out in also our general understandings that maybe we don't want to float above the world. Maybe we do actually want to have our feet on the ground. And that comes with a whole different set of terms about how we embed ourselves societally and how we live. So I don't know, maybe it's a contradiction to your question, but I think that's what I perceive right now.
I love that. I love that that's where you took it. I think in particular because there's many directions we could go with this, but I think one of the first things that comes to my mind also, I've been listening sporadically to interesting conversations around parts work and internal family systems, which is a system that I don't know intimately myself, but it's the idea that within any given person, there are different parts and selves that want potentially different things. And I think as a civilization and a species, there's a reflection in that too, that you cannot, as you say, homogenize and expect there to be a flattening of something which is inherently varied and rich. And there's something about the amount of richness and nuance and beauty that we lose when we try to compress human experience, culture, embeddedness, locality into a very small box that one can then translate across different places. Kind of like the Instagramification of stuff. I was in an airport in Istanbul for an event for the UEFA Champions League. Well, anyway, that's a whole other conversation. But we walked past and there was this, we call them now Instagram cafes, me and my partner, when we see them, because they're the arches and everything looks AI generated and it's just fucking boring. And it's this kind of thing of, have we created conditions with the illusion of the desirability of a loss of friction and a templatization of all these different things, to the extent where now there isn't any edge or unknown to brush up against. And actually we need that edge, we need that unknown to be able to stimulate us into growth and intrigue and creativity. I don't know what you think about. So I kind of chucked a lot at you there.
No, but it's true. I mean, I think that, you can, maybe just to anchor that point, you can bring a lot down to the question of design, right? And what we surround ourselves with or have been surrounded by. And, if you take something like the smartphone, right, which is just over a decade old, it's sort of bizarre to me in a way that we live in a world now where the material that we touch most, probably even more than other humans, is glass.
Yeah.
And that was a design choice made by a team of people in California. And that design choice has now sort of become, I think, a metaphor for what it means to exist in, as you put it, an increasingly frictionless society.
Mm.
And I think that this kind of, I guess what is a smartphone ultimately is a portal into a world of information entertainment that we sort of just move our fingers across in this kind of seductively soft way, which then belies, I guess, the kind of inherent violence of what it means to have access to all that stuff, simultaneously. Um, it's good and bad, but I do think that the question of where we seem to be right now is a certain understanding that there is and always has been profound friction, and that we maybe need to embrace that tension more in order to get back to ourselves in a more embodied way. Because also design should be a thing that helps us to feel more embodied, but it has become a disembodying force in many ways. The smartphone being like a key example, but you could take many, many examples. I always think of like aircraft, right? Like commercial airplanes. So interesting because you go into a plane, whether you're taking a short flight or a long flight. Let's take a long flight as an example.
Yeah.
You're basically you're basically a child. You're basically put into the position of a child where you've got, to make a decision between like chicken or fish. That's basically the only decision that you have to make. And you're essentially in this extremely sophisticated tin can, like rocketing across the sky at 800 kilometers an hour, where you've placed all your trust in a machine and a few people helming that machine. And, you've got this illusion of safety, like a seatbelt, for example. I'm not entirely sure what a seatbelt does in an aircraft emergency, but, who am I to say? And I think that isn't this also some sort of kind of way of thinking about the time we're in? Because, like commercial airline travel has become such I guess, a commonplace thing that we don't think about it anymore. But actually, we're putting ourselves in this incredibly vulnerable position, like a child, like an infant. And we're treated like an infant in that space as well. You have no agency on a plane. You can't scream or shout. You'll be deboarded or, whatever. So you're actually in a very, I think that maybe air travel is an interesting metaphor for like this kind of anodized condition that we seem to have found ourselves in and built for ourselves.
So I'm thinking about, as you're sort of talking about the infantilization of people in a sophisticated machine, I'm also thinking about the infantilization of, for instance, our intellects. Of specifically, let's say 20 years ago, slightly longer, when I was at university, I remember writing longhand essays still. I mean, we had computers, well, not obviously, but like we had computers, but I had some essays on floppy disks. Like this is proper retro. And then getting to the point where, Google comes along, and then in the good old days, you had proper search pages with answers. And then as time goes on, you've got like fewer and fewer of the search pages returned. And then it's just ads and sponsored until it's basically two links that have been aggressively SEO'd to show up underneath the sponsored and ad content. And then now you've got large language models where you don't even have that. You just have one answer, which at a flip of a coin is either right or wrong. And if you provoke it in a sort of a little bit of if you provoke it a little bit, you'll get completely the opposite result. So it's this kind of infantilization of our intellects, our meaning making. And I wonder if when it comes to this kind of this quest to make simpler and more tangible and easier to manage the complexity of our current global systems, that this kind of simplification of knowledge hunting or information gathering or decision making or relating is a way actually of dealing with the overwhelm, because we're just not, I don't think we're evolved to deal with the sheer amount of information and complexity and 24/7 news cycles from all over. It goes back to this thing about being disembodied and not embedded in place, which you mentioned at the very top of our conversation. In the face of all of that, What role do you think creativity can play? Or maybe before we even say that, like in that context, what does creativity mean for you? And then what role can it play?
I mean, I think you're right to bring up this question of creativity, because I think everything you describe points towards a crisis of creativity.
Hmm.
And I think that creativity ultimately is one of the things that makes us like who we are, right? And has also got us to this point. And I think, I work a lot with contemporary culture. This is sort of what I devote my life to, is trying to understand how contemporary culture can tell us where we are and where we're going through the medium of contemporary art, design, digital culture, and so on and so forth. I always say that contemporary art ultimately, for me, is a very simple definition of being the present interrogating itself. A good
Mm.
artist is dealing with the present interrogating itself. Good art teaches us what is happening now in a kind of critical way. And I think that this crisis of creativity is manifesting through that overwhelm for sure. It's creativity is difficult. Creativity takes silence. Creativity takes boredom. Creativity takes friction, as you mentioned earlier. And I suppose all of these things are slowly being diluted, or have been diluted over time, to create a moment where maybe it's not that creativity has gone, it's just that we have less of a clarity in our own intuition over what our creativity can do,
Mm.
right? Like, I mean, it's power. I always like to just really think about how power has a very strange relationship to creativity, because it's like a love-hate relationship. It's like dark, evil forces in this world have always used art as a
Mhm.
way to create their image and construct their following and build their. And as soon as they've used it and exploited it and constructed their following, they then become afraid of it, because it's the only thing that can take them down
Hmm.
ultimately. So it's this kind of continuous sort of seesaw of a relationship between how power understands creativity. And of course, maybe power is here to stay. Maybe power is just the human condition. Any idea of a kind of fully egalitarian society doesn't seem like it's on the horizon, at least in my lifetime. But that means that we've got to deal with that power. We've got to, like, creativity has an agency in relationship to how we create the most egalitarian conditions possible. And that's why it's important. So this crisis of creativity actually has a fundamentally political and civic role to play. If it is disappearing, if it is becoming harder, then that is going to cause much bigger problems. It's going to have much larger consequences for how we live together. And that's something that does actually keep me awake at night, I have to say.
What is it that you most fear? When you're awake at night and you're kind of struggling or contemplating this, what is it that you most fear?
I mean, it goes from the self to the planet, like, in the most sort of selfish sense, is like, as someone who devotes their life to trying to facilitate cultural spaces, I slowly have been witnessing it become more difficult to not only find those spaces or nurture those spaces, but also find the people for those spaces,
Mm.
right? So that's one thing. And on the other hand, at a kind of planetary scale, you do wonder what this will all lead to ultimately. And I suppose it's that uncertainty that is thrilling, but is also very, very unsettling. I
Mm.
think that it's good for things to be unsettled. Also, I think that in this kind of, obviously, in a context in which there is so much information and entertainment possible to us, that is actually this sort of anodization of the sort of creativity is also sort of centering on the idea of a new kind of caution towards anything that might be unsettling or unnerving.
Mm.
And I totally understand that, because I don't want to be unsettled or unnerved. But I also, isn't that what growth needs? Isn't that
Mm.
what growth requires in order to actually take place in a productive, embodied way that you remember? So I do think that there is a certain moment where, and if I just speak from my position, looking at kind of like contemporary art, design, architecture, digital culture, I do see conditions emerging where there's more sameness between geographies. And I guess that's part under the umbrella of this kind of great globalization, because actually, where are people getting their inspiration from, right? They're getting their inspiration from each other, like has always happened, but it's being curated through algorithms and it's being presented different ways. And actually, taste making is now not defined by, a complex or nuanced series of personal experiences, but is defined by a kind of shared understanding of what's important at a moment. And that's also what virality
Hmm.
ultimately becomes. I mean, I'll give you like an example, which I thought was kind of fascinating, is that for those who follow the contemporary art world, they might know that the Venice Biennale just opened, and the Venice Biennale is one of the oldest sort of global gatherings of contemporary art, happening every 2 years, and is, I think, waning in its influence as time goes by, but still a kind of an important gathering point. And there are national pavilions, and those national pavilions are inherently problematic in themselves. But for the case of this example, there was the Austrian pavilion, in
Mhm.
which Florentina Holzinger created a big project called Sea World Venice, in which she's dealing with questions of trying to think about ecological crises, about water and sustainability. And it's a very profoundly complex, beautiful series of installations, which actually manifest with visitors pissing into a toilet, which then gets filtered and goes into a tank where humans are in there. Also,
Wow.
a room in the pavilion with a single person on a jet ski moving around in a circle, an enormous bell suspended on a crane outside the pavilion with a human being swung, ringing it. And the interesting thing
Wow.
is that there was a lot of complexity and nuance to this work. And Florentina Holzinger comes from theater, radical theater, and is one of, I suppose, one of the most interesting makers in that sphere in Europe. But all the nuance was completely lost because it was viral. It went viral, right? It
Yeah.
became the thing that it was so quickly flattened. And I use your word again. It was so quickly flattened
Hmm.
into a 5-second image that, people seem to be even like talking about this work without having seen it, right?
Yeah.
Even at the Venice Biennale. It was around
Wow.
the corner, but they didn't even, it was also heavy queues to go and see it, but it became something. And I think that that's also indicative of what it means also to be a creative today. If you devote your life to creativity and you enter the kind of circus of, let's say, the contemporary art world, one of the things that's, I guess, most challenging is that sometimes you can be picked up so quickly that your reputation precedes your work. And that, I suppose, is something that maybe has always happened in different ways, but it's just can be so loud today, can be so overwhelming.
This is so fascinating. It's really interesting. I mean, I think there's so many elements about what you just described. So the kind of the capture of a creative outcome that stems from a process of inquiry, engagement, and heartfelt exploration of the world. And it's almost like a funnel where you go through a process of exploration of self encounter with your environment, encounter with the crises, and you find a way to relate that to your artistic practice. You create a work which in this instance is a dynamic, embodied, in place, physically impacting, visually impacting, like it's all of the senses. So it's this kind of like this enriched environment in which you are challenged to feel and witness in a place, to then have some sort of response and be aware of that as it's rising, hopefully to witness that. And then that kind of gets compressed, flattened into this two-dimensional image or video, which then gets captured by the algorithm, propagated across all the channels. And there's something really curious about this, about the fact that when you mentioned sort of reputation preceding your work, I've I've been giving this a huge amount of thought for the last few years, and especially with the artists and the musicians that I know. I came to Barcelona to study realist art at the Barcelona Academy of Art, which is kind of it's not as um, traditional, let's say, as Florence Academy, but it's in that vein, you know. So you're standing and drawing
Mm.
people from 10 till 5, and you've got 3.5 years of practice. And one of the things that comes up a lot is the relationship between the outcome of one's creative practice. In this instance, it might be the painting. In your instance, it might be this radical theatrical work. And the AI, the machine, the algorithm, the social media, the platform that compresses. And one of the things that I've noticed is that people are so fucking pissed off with art being compressed or stolen. You know, there's so many examples of musicians who post a clip that gets downloaded. Someone with a bright idea who probably is not a musician goes and creates an entire song, uploads it, and then when the artist who created the song tries to upload their actual song, it violates the copyright of the fake song that was created by someone who had, you know, the bright idea to kind of use AI to flesh in all the other bits. And so I'm definitely noticing in my art, but also in other people's, a move towards not just regionalization, but kind of these tiny circles again. So going on retreats and that being the place where people share music without technology, or living room gigs, or doing exhibitions in places which are not galleries, and where the artwork doesn't get teased out in advance. It's like, this is the thing. It's going to happen on these dates. This is kind of the theme, but if you want to see what it is, you have to be there. And it's almost this, how do we reclaim the power and the viscerality and the creative potential, that meeting between the art that's been created and those for whom it's going to be an experience of encounter, so that the audience, without the machine getting in the way and capturing it or impoverishing it or killing it. It's like the death of art through the machine.
Mm. Well, I mean, we've come so far now that we're never going back, right? That's also, I suppose, the challenge of.
I mean, you're right, but
I think it's yeah, but I think it's also it's the exciting thing as well as the kind of fundamental challenge is that I wake up every morning, and whether I'm, you know, now here in Hong Kong, which is a fresh environment for me in some ways, or whether I'm sort of very decontextualized just in my mind, I'm always trying to think about what is the texture or the material reality that I'm moving through right now. Like what are things saying to me? Like what if I try to focus a little bit, which is difficult, and really look at the reality before me, what you actually see is nuance, right? You see gray area in a sort of moment in which, for I think many people, there is so much defined by sort of binary understandings of what the world is, you know, or very westernized ideas of what time looks like, which, you know, is at least in my mind, because of the context in which I grew up, is very linear. And it's you know, I have many people in my life that definitely understand time in a different way. And it feels like I can't fully understand a more sort of polyphonic way of understanding what time is. But you do notice between different geographies, and I guess this is the privilege of being able to be in different geographies, you do notice that there are different manifestations of time, which manifest profoundly in the way that people meet you and spend time with you or spend time with themselves. You know, the idea of being, I'm not talking about this kind of like Southern Californian, like I'm always 30 minutes late because of the traffic kind of like stuff. That's kind of, I guess, the extreme problematic opposite. But like a kind of softer understanding of the fact that time is not linear and we have a certain degree of agency over it. And I think that people are really craving, I think that this desire for a more analog existence is definitely a reaction, of course, or, you know, is a response to, again, I'm using a binary here, which is sort of like defining, you know, it's stupid of me, but, you know, a reaction against this kind of digitization. I think that there's no longer any meaningful distinction between what is physical and what is digital, what is embodied and what is virtual. And I think that it's quite healthy to think along these lines now, because as I said, there's no going back. Like we have tools and systems that didn't exist 20 years ago that are now part of our everyday. It's unlikely they're going to go anywhere unless there is a massive, you know, explosion from the sun and a very profound like electromagnetic pulse. Because
Mm.
this interesting thing about this, I actually do sometimes think about electromagnetic pulses because years,
Go
for
on.
years I spent time in Scandinavia, right? Where you can wake up in the middle of the night and you can look out of your window and you see an aurora.
Yeah.
It's like hovering above you. Sometimes green mostly, but then the more intense ones are red and purple. And then, if you actually understand what an aurora borealis is, it's actually terrifying. It's an extremely humbling thing. And it's very difficult to explain without like drawing a diagram, for those who, I guess most people have an idea what it is, but the idea that there's been a massive explosion from the sun within 24 hours to a week, that all that kind of, plasma, let's say, is like hurling towards the earth and would like kill us if it wasn't for the earth's magnetic shield. But the magnetic shield comes out from the south
Bonkers.
and north poles and it gets sucked into the top and the bottom of the earth, which is what the aurora is. It's kind of, so actually what you're looking at is the kind of most, when you see the aurora, which is not that I've seen many beautiful things in this world, but there's definitely the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in this world. And it has a sound as well. It crackles. Like if you're
Wow.
really in the deep quiet, if you're in the far north, if you're in Sapmi, in the very north of Scandinavian territory, in the indigenous lands, you really can hear it. But actually, it is just the sun trying to kill us, and and that becomes such a beautiful thing, and it makes you realize that we are just very soft beings in an extremely spiky universe, right? Like it's a miracle we survive because
Yeah.
everything is trying to kill us, and that inherent vulnerability, of course we want to descend back into a space of analog touch, for example. Of course we want to try to find ways of being more embodied in a world of kind of information in all of its shapes and sizes. But I stumbled over the aurora thing. Now I'm thinking about the aurora, but I suppose the point comes down to the fact that we're all very confused. But actually, there are very sort of clear things. I think if you really focus, you understand that time has possibilities in it as much as it has limitations. You understand that, there are things that have happened for millions of years that will continue for millions of years that remind us that we are vulnerable.
Mm.
And we live in a world in which that vulnerability is not so present. And I think that's part of the key kind of question also, maybe about why creativity is maybe more difficult to achieve now. Because maybe you do need, as much as you need friction, you also need vulnerability to be creative.
Fascinating. I was re-listening recently to an interview with an American mythologist called Michael Meade, who talks about apocalypse in its sort of furthest back etymological sense, in the idea of collapse renewal, and that both things happening, not one and then the other necessarily, but potentially concurrently at the same time, which comes to my mind, I think, also because of the way that you described time as polyphonic. I love that expression of thinking about what that could mean. And the idea that actually, when it comes to soft bodies and spiky universes and our capacity to be in a place which is silent enough to hear the crackle of life and the crackle of the threat of death, and the fact that death potentially is what makes life so vivid and vital, there has to be, at some level, a sense of reckoning with the poignance and fragility of life in order to be able to cherish that which you most love. And I think one of the answers that many of the people who are in charge of vast amount of power and money and influence, there's something interesting in the response to our vulnerability being, okay, well, if we can just create technologies to enable us to become transhuman, to be able to create conditions in which we can actually pass more information, as opposed to, okay, we're clearly going in a direction where we're needing to pass more information, but actually part of that is about coming back to our bodies and having a more syncretic or holistic approach. I'm worried about what happens when you end up with people who are kind of hell-bent on just adding channels for more information to come in without creating conditions for that vulnerability to exist, for silence, for for deep reflection, for encounter, where you're not constantly overstimulated by that which is on the outside coming in. I mean, again, that's another binary because we only exist in relationship to everything else. But I think there is something about the direction of travel. So not just about the flow of time, but also how much information and sensory noise are we capable of absorbing and at what cost? And then how do we create boundaries? Thinking back to your earlier point about cultural spaces, creating cultural spaces in which we can have these sorts of investigations and inquiries and encounters where we have the capacity to actually encounter our vulnerability and reflect more deeply.
Yeah. I mean, dominant culture, I suppose we're in a tricky moment for dominant culture because basically any form of sort of vulnerability or, liminality or occupying the in-between
Hmm.
is threatening, you know? Trans people are I often think that trans people are at one of the real kind of pioneering forefronts of like what it means to really be threatened
Hmm.
as a body. And I think that's because, we see dominant culture seems to be returning to this idea of even more binary thinking,
Yeah.
right? That, you either have to be this or that, or it must be this or that. That actually, to be able to occupy a space in between is deeply threatening to whatever is perceived to be the kind of conventional norm,
Hmm.
and I think we see this also in the construction of like love and relationships. There's an amazing book called Monogamous Mind, Polyamorous Terror, by Birgit Vassallo, who I believe is based in Barcelona, actually, is a
Interesting.
Catalan sort of activist and thinker. I hadn't come across her work because she, I think, had mostly been, well, most of her stuff hadn't been translated into English.
Hmm.
And I don't read Catalan or Spanish yet. But, I would love to read her stuff in, I think it's a very good translation. Anyway, this book is really, I suppose, I think a really critical reader for anybody who wants to understand how societal structures define us. And I suppose it's, Monogamous Mind, Polyamorous Terror. It is a provocation as a title, but
Hmm.
actually what the book is mostly doing is just trying to take us through step by step how monogamy is a system of control.
Hmm.
It's not a life choice. It's not an identity. It's a system of control that has manifested in our architectures, in the fact that, across the world, you have an apartment or a house with a bedroom for the parents and two bedrooms for the children. And, our architectures are
Yeah.
defined for, like, let's say, the nuclear family still, and maybe more and more. But also monogamy allows for productivity as well. It creates a very clear structure of control to allow for productivity and ultimately tax paying. But it also, reveals all of the things that, that question of kind of growth or cycles of life where you are educated and then you become productive and then you go into sort of like a period of like demise or collapse where you're thrown into an old people's home and like good luck. I wonder, like, how, I think there are points of resistance, the rise of death doulas, which
Yeah.
I think is a really interesting thing. Because of course I'm terrified of death because I just have never been given the tools to really understand that I do actually have some agency over that. I'm very curious. I'm actually very curious about wondering if one day I could become a death doula. I
Hmm.
know a couple of death doulas. I'm very interested. I mean, I definitely would want to have a death doula, someone to, if I knew I was dying, that could just help guide me through the practicalities and the spiritual sort of like transition of I suppose, like whatever happens in that moment.
Yeah.
And, a death doula once said to me when my grandmother was passing away, from she was quite old, but at the same time she was ill and she was in hospital and she also contracted COVID in hospital. It
Oh,
became a
poor woman.
complete thing. It was a really awful moment because no one could really visit, and I was also
Hmm.
far away anyway. And she was an incredibly important person to me. Um, I reached out to a friend who was a death doula, and she said to me, the thing is that just really sit there and just try to send as much energy to her as possible, because from her experience, the dying takes more energy than you ever expand in your entire lifetime. Those
Mm.
final moments. And she didn't really explain why. It's just an observation that she's had watching people die, that the amount of energy, it's not a smooth thing.
Mhm.
It's like the last great kind of, burst of energy we have is to leave the body. To where is the question? Huh? But it's like, I think that the interesting question about the rise of death doulas also, I suppose, mimics what I keep reading about. I think this is what I've been reading about these last weeks, is that like young people are smoking again,
Mm.
because there's a general amongst the younger generations, there's a general sense of futility of the future, that you're sort of like, well, I mean, why would you? I mean, who cares? You're going to die from something, and it's not like the world is going to be um, pleasant or
Yeah.
kind to us. And it's true. I was on the streets last night. I was at a bar and I was like looking around, and there were like a lot of people like who must have been like 19, 20, 21 smoking. And I don't know, this seems to be a new thing. I don't know. There's a sort of, I guess there's a certain nostalgia connected to it. You resist the generation that came before.
Mm.
But I do think it's interesting that, as younger generations anecdotally start to smoke more, and then at the same time, we have this kind of rise of the death doula who are trying to create a softer and more gentle and more meaningful transition that is more, maybe doesn't have to be secular, but is more sort of rooted in a kind of secular understanding of what passing from one way of existing to another way of existing might look like. There's some interesting relationship there
Mm.
that I'm interested in thinking further about.
Fascinating. It's curious because I think there are so many different movements overlaying one another and pulling in different directions. But I think one of the things that I'm noticing a lot of, or that I'm focusing on, which weaves in, kind of arises from what you were saying about how do we meet death and think about mortality and about the meaning in life. And on the one hand, looking at, populism and faith in some sort of father figure that's authoritative and going to take the decisions for us to an extent. The kind of technological paternalism that's in there, the sort of strongman idea, the return to, you mentioned sort of this binary, like let's keep the choices simple, quote unquote. The pullback in the
Chicken or
states of
fish?
chicken or fish, or Roe v. Wade being overturned, and
Exactly.
corrosion of rights that people have died to protect. Um, the unsafety, that the risk of being in a body which is rejected by many people for lack of compassionate understanding. Like, and you can draw those lines around different circles of people back through time. But I think there's something about, so that's sort of in one direction, I think there's kind of this clenching that can be very tempting. Tell me what to do, tell me where the box outline is, and I'm just going to kind of stick to it. That's an oversimplification, and there's a lot of stuff that I'm not touching on, like the richness of certain traditions and the rest of it. But then on the flip side, I think there's also, I've noticed a return towards, or perhaps kind of a yearning for greater ecological relating. Like, what does it mean to interbe or to interbecome with all the species that exist? What does it mean to have a different conception of life where the individual, yes, obviously I'm speaking to you on a screen and you exist and I exist, but we're in participatory conversation together. It doesn't happen. This conversation doesn't happen without the wealth of experience that you've had in your life and all the people who've loved you and the lovers you'd had and the friends you've had and all of that stuff. And so I think there's also this question of thinking about the individual as part of a larger body, like a river that flows on. And so I'm also noticing people move towards animist practices or Zen Buddhist non-dualist practices or druidic paths and rituals. And I think one of the things that I noticed that might be useful, that we no longer have as much of, in certainly in Western, more industrial worlds, secular worlds, is initiation. for different phases of life because it's become so commodified. If you turn 13, teenagers might have a certain type of birthday, or when you get married, you have a celebration, or when you get divorced, or as opposed to coming of age for young men and women when women or girls menstruate, or um, boys go through some sort of initiatory practice, or those who are gender non-conforming have their own, like, to have spaces for each individual, each person within an embedded community to be brought across a threshold to explore who are you in this world and what does that mean for the awakening of a vocation, perhaps without necessarily it having to be a big thing. But there's a lack of that, and I think people are yearning for this. And I think that also connects with our relationship to death. I think those that most fear death want the longest life, but aren't necessarily pursuing the things that would make it the most meaningful. Like if
Mm.
you've lived a rich life at the age of 70 or 80 or 90, and you've attended to it with a quality of attention and presence, that's going to be a different kind of death, I would guess, than someone who is always grasping and never. I don't know. It's
Yeah, I
hard to
mean, I
talk in
think
such. I'm
no,
massively
no,
oversimplifying.
we're talking about big issues, but I do think that it is definitely about how much time in your life you get to process things, process traumas, process happy memories,
Mm,
whatever. Like, I think that everything, to just go back to the root of the question, right? Like everything that we seem to be um, discussing in this conversation, from the frictionless surface of the smartphone all the way through to this sort of like different forms of spirituality that are emerging through the figure of the death doula, or the rituals of astrology or tarot or whatever, are all like hinting towards a a desire to sort of connect with what's hidden.
yeah.
And there's so much that's hidden. Like, I mean, I was asked to write a column a couple of years ago about the body. And I think the first of that column was about the interstitium. Have you heard about this?
I know about interstitial spaces or moments, but interstitium, I'd love to
The
hear more.
interstitium is that, I mean, the so-called interstitium is a sort of connective tissue
Mhm.
that exists in all of our bodies. It's like a web or like a matrix or like a superhighway that transports all sorts of like fluids, mostly collagen fluids,
Mm,
between the organs, right? So again, like medicine, the Western medicine has always defined, I think it's always been bizarre that we say, oh, we have lungs and we have a heart and we have a liver, and,
mm,
we separate these things, right? But I mean, of course, they are deeply, deeply interwoven with each
yeah.
other. And there was always some confusion, I think, about how how certain things moved around the body, like outside of the bloodstream, cancers, and so on and so forth. And I'm not going to have all the facts here. You can look it up and find the facts that if you desire. But essentially, Western medicine has always been defined by what you can see, right? So you
Yeah.
cut open a corpse, and what you see is what there is. But there is this thing inside us that is extremely fragile, that is almost like, you would argue, the biggest organ of the body, that connects everything. And it's not been seen because it disappears as soon as you die, because it's essentially just fluid. But it is perhaps the most important thing in the body. And of course, if you think about it, if you go back to like ancient Chinese medicine, or like contemporary Chinese medicine, has always talked about energy flows and water flows around the body. And of course, they knew about it. That's for the same thing,
Hmm.
right? Except it had been forgotten, or it had been violently hidden from view. And now we're sort of like unsheathing this kind of, yeah, matrix that exists within us, this sort of honeycomb network of chambers and tissue that kind of make it the most important thing of, okay, no, it's amongst the most important things in the body. So I don't know, like for me, these little moments remind us that there is so much we don't know. And I suppose this sort of move towards thinking more spiritually about death, or this move to thinking about how, ancient astrology might affect us today, um, is simply because we have we have more desire to understand what we don't know, or to at least understand that we don't know. I would say for me, this is true, at least. And it's happened gradually over my life. A certain kind of growing humility,
Hmm.
which might be normal. I don't know. Or maybe I'm just part of the herd mentality.
Well, I mean, ojalá that the humility is part of the herd mentality. Let's get that going viral.
Exactly. That'd be
um,
nice, actually.
yeah, it would be amazing. One of the things I wanted to ask you about that I've made a note to raise in this conversation today was a beautiful term that you raised at the Gottlieb Duttweiler talk that you gave, and it was about world glimpsing. And we've kind of touched on various themes that, in my mind, connect with this throughout our conversation. So, encountering or yearning for that which is hidden, the great mystery, um, the capacity to create spaces in which we can have a sense of silence, or the vulnerability that we encounter, the constant noise that we're exposed to, the kind of ways in which we're encouraged to interact through our glass devices, to a world which is much richer than one might touch through our fingertips on a phone. Um, can you tell us a little bit more about what world glimpsing is? And I'm particularly curious to ask if you have any practices to touch into other futures, other possibilities of what worlds might yet be created.
Mm, yeah. No, I mean, world glimpsing is a word that I just came up with a few years ago, mostly because I was extremely frustrated by the words world making and world
Mm,
building, which are fairly ubiquitous terms these days. Not only, I mean, definitely in contemporary art, but also I think more broadly. I think they're very damaging terms, right? Because they sort of suggest that you can construct a complete world, a complete, whether that's in the consensus reality that we all exist within right now, or other versions of the world. And I think that they have colonial hangovers, and I think they're also quite limiting
mm,
in their definition. So the idea of world glimpsing is essentially trying to sort of provocatively provoke the idea that maybe we can't create a complete world, but we can create structures or frameworks or portals into alternate versions of reality that ultimately require other people to join in with their
mm,
own baggage and their own positions and their own histories, in order to sort of, and their own imaginations, crucially, in order to fill in those worlds. And this is also the title of an exhibition that I made, which is currently on in Stockholm and will open in the Netherlands later this year, um, which is precisely trying to look at the relationship between worlding strategies and role play. And role play is something I've been obsessed with as a concept for many, many years. It took me a long time to sort of massage it into an exhibition that a national museum could get behind.
it's
But
astounding.
role play really for me is just so fascinating because we all know how to role play. It's not something that, crazy larpers do on a weekend, or something that like children do when they're testing out their own identities. Role play is something that definitely children can do better than adults on the most part. But role play is something that we do. We're a different person with our partners, with our close friends, with acquaintances, with our colleagues, with, whoever. We play different roles continuously,
Mm,
subconsciously. Because, I just use this term consensus reality, which is a kind of interesting term, I think, which describes essentially the kind of, that David Foster Wallace quote where two fish are swimming along and one fish looks at the other fish and says like, um, how's the water? And the other fish goes, what's water? You know,
yeah.
it's the same mechanism, right? Is that consensus reality is the water that we all are swimming in that we can't see
Mm,
because we're in it and we're participating in its creation as well. But if you step outside of consensus reality by imagining an alternate world, and there's entire incredible creative spheres devoted now to role play as a practice. And this is not just cosplay, although like cosplay and live action role play, these are definitely part of that sphere. But, I worked with Omsk Social Club, a decentralized art collective based around Europe that have created an enormous 3-hour-long facilitated psychodrama experience as part of this exhibition, World-Glimpsing, that allows you to sort of step inside and be taken step by step into a world where you can become someone else. You can become a different gender, you can become a different species, you can become a different age, and then you can play together. You can play being the kind of operative word here, because not only do we maybe not accept that we are all role playing all the time, but I think most of us are not so good at playing also, or thinking playfully as adults, because everything is so serious. And, there's real stakes. But I think honestly, the way out of maybe some of the swamps that we find ourselves in is, on the one hand, operating playfully. On the other hand, acknowledging that, between all of these, I suppose, speculative practices that allow us to glimpse alternate worlds or reframe the one that we know, we actually do have agency over society, cultural behavior, identity. And I think that it's also good, it's also important to remember that, the worlds, maybe I should use plural there, that we exist in, this consensus reality has been designed and it can be redesigned.
Mm.
That's why I think that, the trans experience is so important, because that's the design of the self in a really active way. But we're all designing and redesigning ourselves continuously. So, I suppose that this question of world glimpsing, it's nothing kind of dramatically radical in any way. It's simply my way of trying to sort of reframe something that I think is already happening, but also try to give us access into understanding the agency within it, that we all have individually and collectively. I'm a world glimpser. I'm trying to get the term more embedded.
I love it. I love it. But I think also there's so much that's in the language that we use. There are so many assumptions built in. Even your catching of the word world and converting it to worlds. No, it's a simple single letter that suddenly
Totally.
implies so much. And I think there's something about our attentiveness to language, your attentiveness to language, and the kind of worlds that you'd like to live within or create, where more possibility is palpably there. And I think that's one of the fronts at which, for me at least, creative people, whether it's capital A artists or capital M musicians or people who paint on the weekends or like in whatever way creativity courses through your life or shows up, I think that's the front that, for me at least, we're called to encounter. It's this sense of not accepting that the future has been written and will look like surveillance capitalism and screens and extraction and the kind of exploitation of all the resources which are living beings in ecosystems and one another and attention, all of this kind of that there are other ways to experience the world, to experience life and death and time and relationship. And I think this is one of the reasons I think why I was so drawn to inviting you into conversation, is because when you got up on the stage and you talked about this, implied within world glimpsing was this vitality and the possibility of the beauty and the chaos that exists in a world that we simply cannot control and constrain, as much as some of us at times would like to wish that we can. So we're coming towards the end of the conversation, and one of the things I'd love to ask you is, when you encounter really challenging days, when it's really difficult, or when you're lying awake at 3 or 4 in the morning and you're thinking, what the fuck is going on with this world? And, how do I get through? How do you orient yourself towards life and beauty and creativity in those moments?
I've always written. I think writing is a way of thinking for me. So I've always journaled. I've always written more than I've read, actually, which is sort of, yeah, strange. And it's definitely, I'm writing more and reading less as time goes by, which is something I'm not entirely sure I'm comfortable with. But I have 3 notebooks. I have a daily journal. which is more kind of prosaic, like who did they meet? What did they think of them? You know, sort of like observational.
Mm.
I have a notebook called Love that essentially is me writing down. I mean, it's mostly a sob story, but yeah, it has a lot of,
Oh.
like me trying to sort of, I guess, compartmentalize my own journey in trying to understand like what love is and how I love and how I receive love and how I give love and how the people
Mm.
close to me receive and give love. And I have another notebook, which is basically just poetry, which is a bit of a mess. And sometimes I can extract things from that into an actual poem. But when I'm really feeling like bewildered, I essentially just go into these books. And this happens once every couple of days where,
Mm.
I suppose what it's doing is, I suppose it's a grounding exercise because it reminds me that, yes, I have been through things that have been a struggle and I have been through things that have been less of a struggle. But, you talk about it all being a mess. I mean, this is what these journals prove. These journals
Mm.
prove that it's always been a mess and it will always be a mess. And like, any sense of control is going to be an illusion. And I get why I yearn for control sometimes
Mm.
because it's safety. It's the way that I was taught to feel safe.
Yeah.
And unlearning that is part of the process I'm going through, at least. So to ground myself, I just look back at my own interpretation of what I've been through. And I suppose there's a bit of a distance to it, but it just reminds myself that like anything is possible, for good and for bad. Like the day
Mm.
that's coming can be full of, will be full of unexpected things. And that's, I just guess, why we're here. Um, I think you also realize to not just labor the point about the love thing, is you realize how broken we are, you know, like how much of us are on a healing process.
Mm.
And then how many of us find it difficult to give ourselves grace in that process.
Mm.
So I think it's, for me, just anchoring into that fact that, yes, I've made mistakes and I've also done good things. And, it's all in this kind of great soup that is at least my existence, that has interrelationality with other people's existence,
Yeah.
grounds me.
That's very beautiful and very practical, and very honest.
I'm a Capricorn. Yeah, I'm very practical.
So then I'd love to finish perhaps by asking you if there was a particular question or idea or suggestion that you'd like people to ponder or dwell with or reflect on right now, what might that be?
Ooh, good question. I suppose if we could all ponder why we categorize things,
Hmm.
I think that would be a useful thing to ponder because I'm not entirely sure it's useful. I'm not sure it ever was, and I'm not sure it's gonna be. So why we constantly seem to want to categorize things is a question that I think is ripe for thought.
I love it. It was unexpected and provocative and juicy. The whole conversation was. James, thank you so much. Is there
Thank
anything that you'd
you.
like to point people towards? Obviously, you have this fantastic exhibition happening. Can you tell us again what it is, where people can find it, and any other things that you'd like to direct people's attention to?
Yeah, the exhibition world-glimsping is on right now in Stockholm at Agdes Moderna and it will open later this year in Rotterdam at the New Institute. And it's worth coming if you can in an embodied way because there is this role play experience by
Mm.
Omsk Social Club that is, I think, very much like worth an experience. Um, I hope people come to that. In terms of other things to point towards, I don't know. Maybe we should point inwards a little bit. I
Love
don't know.
it.
I'm a big fan of journaling. I don't know. Like I feel like it a lot is answered in as you describe it, that pen to paper thing. I
Mm.
because I handwrite. This is not typed.
Mm.
Because I don't know. My hand gets tired when I write, which I don't think
Mm.
it used to. Which also, in a way, makes me be more concise and precise when I write
Yeah.
um, longhand. Maybe we should do that a bit more. I don't know.
Bit cheeky channeling. All right. Well, thank you so much. It's just been such a joy talking with you. I really appreciate it.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Natalie.